Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are talking about a book from New Zealand called Hidden Stories of Heroism for a Peaceful Planet. Our guest is the book's author, Linda Hansen, a New Zealand-based author of books for both adults and children, with a wonderful website at lphansen.com. That's lphansen.com. Linda Hansen, welcome to Talk World Radio.
Thank you, David. Good to be here.
Thanks for coming on. Wonderful stories in this book, many from New Zealand, some from around the world. The first one is maybe chapter one was maybe the most interesting to me, about this group called Moriori, whose culture might sound made up to a lot of people who live in this violence saturated culture and excuse it as human nature and so forth. What can you tell us about these people?
I can tell you that their history has been being rebuilt over the last 40 years, that I was literally taught at school that they were extinct, that they had been exterminated by a really terrible invasion, but that is not so. And it was a way of covering up quite a shocking episode. Now, they are a culture, Polynesian culture. They came to this part of the world around 600 years ago. They did not come from New Zealand. Their oral traditions have them going directly to their islands, which are off the east coast of the South Island in New Zealand. And they brought with them a covenant of peace. And it's a long established tradition where they taught and established with the birth of every child that the gods had the power to give and take life. Humans did not. And that was their culture. And they allowed combat, and they were very good at it with green sticks they would use to do stick fighting. But the first sign of blood, and they had to stop. They also wrestled to let off steam and so on. But in that whole 600-year history, their oral traditions are, like many cultures, intact. And they have no record of a single death being lost by human intervention. So they were a totally they lived this culture. And
then the British came, and they were not completely exterminated, a familiar lie about people who lived where I am in North America as well.
Yeah, but the British. No, I'll interrupt you there, David, not the British. They had a few sealers and whalers that kind of landed up on their shores and began to live alongside them. There were a few Europeans, but very few, and some Maori from the mainland in New Zealand, some warrior tribes. They'd been cast out of their own area through fighting. They learned about this culture, and they commandeered a couple of ships, literally, commandeered them at the point of spears and guns, and they came to invade with the intention of invading. And the story is almost impossible to believe that the Moriori welcomed them because they were very seasick on the voyage. It's a very tough trip to get there. And the Maori arrived very ill, and they were nursed back to health. And then as soon as they were well, they began to walk the land and kill those they found. And there weren't that many of them. Moriori did outnumber them, and they all withdrew, and they had a 3-day conference until everyone has been heard. And they spoke, and they said, "We will not break our covenant of peace." And it's almost impossible to believe, but they offered themselves up in a sense. And the outcome was horrific. Slavery, cannibalism. It was dreadful. And the survivors, and there were some, they wrote to the Governor General, they begged for help, but they were ignored. And it is a most shameful story, that the resident Europeans did absolutely nothing. And
And so they were not completely exterminated, which is a popular lie, but they were killed in huge numbers.
they were killed in huge numbers. They were enslaved, and they were also sold off on to ships and so on as slaves. And of course, they kept their culture intact. They knew perfectly well who they were. And so, in the days of modern communication, they began to get together again from all around the world, in fact, and re-establish themselves. It wasn't easy, but they re-established themselves as a trust, which means unity, and they vowed to sort of restore their culture, which they are doing. They went to New Zealand's primary Indigenous court, which is called the Waitangi Tribunal. You might have heard of the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand. And the Waitangi Tribunal found that their story was accurate, that they had not been driven off their lands, they were not defeated, and that they were the rightful owners of their land. And since then, it's been a difficult journey for them, as you can imagine, to restore themselves.
In addition to which, you can find, including in later chapters in your book, the possible influence of their nonviolent culture on other cultures. But still, in the short term, what happened to them looks more like a failure of nonviolence than a success of nonviolence. And I wonder whether that doesn't have something to do with the fact that I can read papers and websites listing all the nonviolent, peaceful societies around the world ever, and they aren't included. They aren't there. I wonder if the fact
they are not there.
like a failure has something to do with that.
Yes, and they could have been thought of as a failure, but in fact, the tribe that invaded them were from Taranaki and the North Island, and they had to be immensely influenced by this culture. They took the women as wives. They were a warrior people who were almost shamed by the courage of these people. And when the Europeans in the North Island began to take over farming land, and some people from the very same tribe set up a large community there, they called it Parihaka. And it was a community of non-violent resistance. It was supported in every way, financially and with food, and also with people from those tribes who had invaded down in the Chatham, what's called the Chatham Islands, Reikahu. And they returned, most of them returned to their homelands because things had changed. And they began to support this very large community of Parihaka, which is still going and is still honoured and has, in fact, influenced many, many, many people around the world. So it's not too difficult to stretch to feel that the power of that early movement had some influence.
And in chapter 2 of the book, we read about Maori nonviolence and, correct me if I'm wrong, the British coming. And again, it's not a glowing success for the tools of nonviolence. It's before the age of mass media. There's no shaming the people with their violence, and the people are brutally killed, right?
No. That isn't. No. In fact, that is the miracle of Parihaka, that it was a community and they were resisting by very provocative means, ploughing up surveyors' roads and so on, but offering no violence. That was their culture, to respond to no provocation, no threats,
right,
and so on. And eventually, one particular minister of the Crown got fed up with this, and he could not take the land he wanted without the Maori, ploughing up the roads and the survey pegs and so on. And they were imprisoned by the hundred, but still it went on. And eventually they did invade this particular minister, Minister Bryce. He invaded, and the Maori were simply sitting on the grass, singing. The children gave bread to the invading forces. There was not a single life lost on either side, not one. There was destruction of property and so on, but the invaders simply couldn't do it. They could not, although they had their sabres and everything at the ready, and they were on horseback and so on, they simply could not attack. Maori simply sat there and looked at them. 2,000 of them, of adults and a lot of children. And the children were singing and dancing and welcoming them.
So this one is a remarkable success story.
It is a massive success. It is, and of course there were imprisonments, there was destruction of property, there were assaults on the women, which were pretty grim, but not a single life was lost on either side. And there were journalists there, no mass media, David, but there were journalists hiding. They were forbidden to be there, but they were hiding, and they recorded everything and reported everything. So
wonderful.
Astonishing story. Yeah.
More people need to know that. It needs to be widely known. The book, again, is called Hidden Stories of Heroism for a Peaceful Planet by our guest, Linda Hansen. And if you are watching the video version of this, you'll see me holding it up.
Thank you.
You've said that you had to gain cultural permission to tell these stories. How?
I did, yes. I'm quite clearly a white woman, Danish, but still white, and I do not have any Maori or Moriori ancestry, and so I would not have done this without the courtesy of gaining permissions. I did my research and so on, but then I went to representatives to make sure that they were comfortable with what I was writing, because these are controversial topics, and for a white person to, write about them takes, it can be offensive, and also it's so easy to misunderstand, so easy to misplace a few words here and there and interpret. And I found that very obvious when I came to get editors for my book. One publisher took the book, and then the editor rushed in with a red pen and simply gave the old version of the Moriori, the one that had been taught so ignorantly.
That they didn't exist anymore, you mean?
Yeah. And other things that had been claimed about them to sort of solve the nation's conscience, really.
Yeah.
So I had to step in very quickly there, and I in fact moved on to another publisher because, I could see how needed the book was.
Well, I am glad you found one. There are a lot more chapters about incredible stories of peacemaking people around the world. Chapter 3 is about the great Bertha von Suttner, whose story I think is maybe very appropriate now in a moment when more and more people are seeing the Nobel Peace Prize as having become a Nobel War Prize. Who was Bertha von Suttner, and what would she think of the state of this prize that she helped create?
Yes, Bertha was a remarkable young woman. She was born into the nobility, but she lived in real poverty. Her father had died when she was a child, and her mother was a bit of a gambler. And so Bertha had to earn a living, and she trained as a governess. She went to work in the home of Arthur with her future husband, but they were not at all keen on this young woman with no money and position behind her marrying into the family. And so she was thrown out, more or less. And she went out, answered an advertisement for a man who turned out to be Alfred Nobel. And he described himself as elderly. He was 42, but he took Bertha in as his housekeeper and manager and so on. And they became very, very close friends. They stayed friends all their lives, although shortly afterwards, Bertha did run away with her beloved, and they married and so on, and later were welcomed back into the family. She wrote a best-selling book. I think it was translated into 17 languages, I think, reprinted at least 40 times. She was acknowledged world leader of the peace movement that she started. It was huge.
A book
And
called Lay Down Your Arms.
Lay Down Your Arms, that's right, yes. And Alfred Nobel had said to her, if you can convince me, I'll do something great for the peace movement. And so in his will, he'd already established all his other prizes, of course, but in his will, he established the Nobel Peace Prize in response to all his admiration, really, of all the work that Bertha had done.
And if the people giving out the prize obeyed what it says in his will, it would be a much better thing.
It would be, indeed, yes.
But
she certainly won it for her audacity to oppose the horrors of war. And of course, in a country like Austria, with its history of warfare, centuries of warfare, she was audacious.
She made people think war could be abolished. And
she did. And she gave them hope. She gave them a valid alternative. She was a very fine scholar, and she corresponded with people all over the world. Yes, there is a possibility that she knew of Parihaka through her communications with Tolstoy and his communications with Gandhi. But it's a long shot, but it's possible.
Yeah. And there's a later chapter in the book where the influence of these nonviolent cultures in New Zealand is seen in Samoa as well. And
that's correct. Yes,
that Gandhi did know of this as well, right?
It's possible. Certainly, in the Parihaka historian tradition, some representatives came to visit the rebuilt Parihaka because, of course, it had been destroyed, but they rebuilt it, and they, in fact, had electricity before Wellington City. It was a very advanced community in its day, and it was visited by some Irish who went on to visit Gandhi. And I have seen a record of someone's finding a photograph of one of the founders of Parihaka on Gandhi's desk. Yeah, so
that would definitely suggest awareness. But in Samoa, there were nonviolent efforts that were yes. Inspired by this, right?
Yes, there was. After World War I, there was a very unfortunate person put in to govern after the area was sort of given in the times way of those days. After the Treaty of Versailles, you will remember that land was parcelled out as though it were packages of butter. And Samoa was given to New Zealand with a very unfortunate administrator, a very racist administrator. And the people there were banned from government. They were banned from participating in their own government, but they were friends with a man who was a very well-known Minister of the Crown in New Zealand, a Māori, who had been in Parihaka as a little child, and one of the horses had trampled his foot, and he was 5, and he was very well known for having a very pronounced limp. And he was great friends with people in Samoa through him, Maui Pomare, so Maui Pomare. They learned of Parihaka. And they learned, of course, that Maori were participating in government in New Zealand. They were talking to a Minister of the Crown who was Maori. And so they more or less said, well, why not us? And he gave them some of the background to Parihaka, which they applied. and with tremendous courage. And they formed a movement called the Mao, and they fought for their independence and for a right in their own governance.
And this is prior to the movements that Gandhi was involved with in India, right? This was.
Oh, definitely. Yes, this was 1919. It was after the war. Yes, First World War.
Um, the book again is called Hidden Stories of Heroism for a Peaceful Planet by our guest LP Hansen, or Linda Hansen, and a number of the chapters are about conscientious objectors,
Yes.
which I am afraid is not good news, but I'm afraid may be more and more needed going forward. What should we learn from the past?
Yes, the tradition in New Zealand of volunteer army was very, very shaken up during a time of peace. The most shocking event, really, which turned out to be, we New Zealanders didn't know it at the time, it turned out to be an experiment by the British to try, who wanted to have conscription in their own country, but didn't dare. And so they experimented in New Zealand, and they somehow flattered the New Zealand government into bringing in this horrific law during a time of peace and during a time of great social progress in New Zealand. In fact, women and men, of course, but women had been voting for a long time. There was a very strong union movement with adult education. There was free education throughout the country, free secular education, universal education for everybody. And it was a very progressive time when in came this law without warning that all boys from 12 to 21, 12 years old, were to be conscripted and undertake military training. And it was a great shock to the people of New Zealand. It was very harshly applied. This was a time, of course, when New Zealand was farming nation, and a 12-year-old boy did his share on the farm. He worked on the farm. He didn't have time to go off and do all these nonsensical marching and gun practice and so on. And so a lot of the boys, for physical reasons as well, they lived too far from anywhere they could do this training. And so they didn't register, and they were fined. They were brought before the courts and fined. The fines were substantial. If they couldn't pay the fines, they were imprisoned. And I'm talking about children here.
Yeah.
And the youngest was 14. And of course, there were no facilities in this country for political prisoners. And these children were locked up with regular murderers and thieves and so on. And it was an absolutely shocking time. And the whole country was united in this uproar against this piece of legislation. It brought everyone together. And a lot of peace movements began then that are still going today. All sorts of strong, strong movements. Some wonderful examples of heroism came out of that, as these children were left without any support in a lot of cases. The trades union support was tremendous. They used to pay the fines of any boys and the families of their members. The women's movement, because boys who were didn't register, they lost their civil rights. It's something New Zealand is quite good at doing. And I'm telling you this because this is really the background to the conscientious objector movement that became so strong here. And the cover of the book is, in fact, for that very story. That's why that child is in prison behind bars, because the youngest, as I said, was 14 years old and he was locked up. And this went on. People left the country. People went into hiding. There were posters put up in Britain suggesting that people not emigrate to New Zealand because their boys would, be straight away put into the armed forces. And against this background was this the loss of the volunteer system of joining the army. It became this conscripted system, and I think every military person knows that conscripted soldiers are very poor soldiers. They don't want to be there. And, whereas you can have your volunteer soldier, they join the army if they want to, like any other job, and they will make a different type of person.
Until we get rid of armies altogether. It is so
absolutely
wonderful.
And against this background, which this was only really overturned by the outbreak of the First World War. Yeah. This whole movement was still going. They raised the age to 14, but they still they couldn't vote. They couldn't take up scholarships. Lots of things. And of course, the women were outraged because women in New Zealand had been the first in the world to vote. And now all their boys were losing the right to vote for 10 years, in fact. So that led to the conscientious objectors like Archibald Baxter. He was one of the most famous in New Zealand.
Yes.
He is well known, and he wrote a wonderful book after his experiences. And I've found myself, it's become a textbook in other countries for.
We've got less than 2 minutes left, Linda Hansen, and there are many more wonderful stories we haven't touched on in this book, Hidden Stories of Heroism for a Peaceful Planet. And I think it's wonderful for the people of New Zealand to keep this history alive of resistance to war, and for the rest of the world to benefit from this history in New Zealand. Are you familiar, Linda, with the story that's told in this wonderful movie called Soldiers Without Guns?
I am very familiar with it. I've seen the movie several times, and it's a great story. Yes,
it's an example of these traditions still being alive, I think.
I think so. And people have, modern peace builders have claimed, if it hadn't been for this tradition, New Zealand could never have pushed through its nuclear-free legislation, because the foundation was there and it was so strong. So it bears out my conviction that humans aren't born violent, that we learn it through culture and we can unlearn it. And these are examples of people who have. They've given everything in spite of a culture that may have taught them violence. They have unlearned it. And that's what I marvel at. I marvel at these people who have been able to restore their own inherent goodness. And I honor them for that.
It's wonderful to have a country that's in a nuclear-free zone, and it's wonderful to have people who can do what was done in this film, Soldiers Without Guns, and make peace without guns where the armed peacekeepers had failed. And the traditions in this book are terrific. Again, it's called Hidden Stories of Heroism for a Peaceful Planet. The website is lphansen.com. And we have been speaking with the author, Linda Hansen. Thank you so much for writing the book and for coming on Talk World Radio.
Thank you, David.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.